On the subject matter of freedom of religion and belief, that is one of the United Nations mandate. And most recently, our contribution and our work in that realm of freedom of religion belief has been towards contributing to the United Nations Special Rapporteur's report on Islamophobia / anti-Muslim sentiment, but also within the context of discrimination against Muslims within Muslim societies themselves, or discrimination towards Muslims by Muslims themselves. So when you talk about religious freedom, there are different perspectives. There are your obvious Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment and legislation like we are starting to see, or we have seen here in the United States with quote unquote the Muslim ban travel by President Trump, and subsequent ones that are being passed into law in Denmark and France. So as a Muslim organization, the work that we've done has always been, when we talk about religious freedom, it is a very broad perspective. It is not necessarily about, oh, the hate being perpetuated against Muslims by non-Muslims. That is actually too easy. I think what's more complicated is the diversity within Muslim societies themselves. And as progressive feminist Muslims, one thing that I've noticed over and over again is a blind spot towards Muslims who are advocating for human rights for all. And so as a Muslim organization, human rights organizations, we are very particular in advocating for human rights in the context of Islam. So religious freedom for us, using the sacred texts in the Quran, there is no compulsion in faith. And the many examples of Prophet Muhammad's very liberating practices towards non-Muslims or those who choose to convert out of Islam, etc. We are, what we do is we use those positions and sacred texts to defend Muslim rights at the United Nations, particularly when the Muslims are being discriminated or sentenced to death by Sharia courts for apostasy and blasphemy, for example, like particularly in Saudi Arabia, Iran, or most Muslim majority countries. The intolerance towards religious freedom is undeniable and very tremendous violations of human rights. And as the latest example, I've been working in Burundi for the last 4.5 years with some imams, and we have an initiative called Imams for She, and it is basically borrowing from the United Nations program called He for She, where we partner with religious leaders, male religious leaders who are affirming of women and girls' rights. And we're talking about women and girls' rights that have been given to Muslim women 1,400 years ago that we are unfortunately still fighting for, like the right to go to school, the right to decide who you marry, when you marry, if you want to marry, just basic human self-determination rights. So through this initiative, we have now a network of over 200 imams in Burundi, DRC, and Rwanda. And what has happened recently during Christmas time is that the more radical elements of Islam, imams, have tried to assassinate him. And this is like the third time they've tried to assassinate him. And this time they are close to surviving. So he's poisoned with arsenic. And what is unfortunate is that when it comes to saving progressive Muslims and women and human rights affirming Muslims in this particular context, oftentimes we are met with a blind spot that, oh, it's not really relevant because they are not human rights defenders that are fighting against the government, or they are not ex-Muslims, because I can assure you, if I was an ex-Muslim, I would be swimming in money, let's put it that way. But there are all these basic different levels of judging us as human rights defender, depending on what spectrum you are as a Muslim. And this is something that I'd like to call attention to everyone. And we have filed our report with the United Nations Special Rapporteur Ahmed Shahid in regards to this matter, and how member states, that is, governments that are where Muslims are minorities, like in Burundi, DRC, Kenya, us here in the West, in the United States, in Latin America, where there needs to be a little bit more attention paid to Muslims in their Muslim constituencies who are also citizens who need the protection from more radical elements of our society. And this is a religious right as well. And the recommendations obviously is when, particularly here in the United States, is a good example, when presidents have their interfaith panels, that the spectrum of faith leaders should be very diverse, including for Muslims. It shouldn't be just the conservative Muslims, it should be all kinds of Muslims, Ahmadiyya, Sufi, Sunni, Shia, you name it, right? Just as there are a diversity of religious leaders that are included in other faith traditions, like the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition. So I am calling on our government, the next government, when they do put together an interfaith advisory committee, or whatever they're going to be calling it, to include progressive and feminist minded Muslims on their panel, because that is one way for member states to pay attention to the undercurrents of what's going on within their societies. And this, I call this, I've done so many times with the European member states as well, but the European member states are in general a little bit more afraid of touching religion, period. So that's an even more difficult hurdle, even with a climate of what happened in France with the beheading of the teacher Paty, etc.